Okay, I got this new setting idea. Think Game of Thrones Westeros-esque, tons of political intrigue, family infighting, and anyone can die at any time. Sounds like a cool setting for babies. Okay. All right, Warhammer 40k, chainsaw guns, blood, gore, everywhere, constant war. Oh yeah, maybe next we can play the Care Bear RPG. Okay, Middle-earth, Sauron wins. Dark Lord ruling over everything, constant orcs, goblins everywhere, oppressing everyone, darkness rules. That sounds like a really interesting setting. If I was 12. Okay, Edge Studio just came out with this new setting. There's only one god, but they're evil. They have night kings that rule underneath them. Elves and dwarves are outlawed from even existing. Magic is outlawed. Clerics can't even be played. Keep talking. Yes. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today we have a very special review for you all. A brand new 5th edition setting from Fantasy Flight Games and Edge Studio, Midnight Legacy of Darkness. Now, I say brand new. Fantasy Flight has had the Midnight setting, but this is a brand new 5th edition offering from them, and their first D&D offering in a while, from Edge Studio being their RPG house over at Fantasy Flight. So first of all, big thank you to the team over there for giving me a copy for review purposes. And yeah, just a disclaimer, they did give me a copy for free for reviewing it, but that's not going to affect my biases or my ability to give a fair review and let you all know whether or not this is worth picking up. So first and foremost, this is a dark setting. If you couldn't tell from my little skit at the beginning of this video, this is a setting for people that enjoy playing heroes that are fighting against darkness and seemingly insurmountable odds. Now, a quick content warning that Fantasy Flight are kind enough to provide in the book as well. So general content warning for the following things when it comes to this setting. If any of these things are potentially triggering to you, then either have a conversation with your table about these things, which they do give guidelines for, of having this conversation. And it is possible to omit and not highlight certain things when you're running a campaign or adventures in this setting. But just as a general broad view, war is a huge part of this, but specifically invasion by a foreign power is a big aspect of this setting. Slavery, and that is a big thing that the villains commit. Child abduction and child soldiers is something that the evil side does, and then torture and murder and human sacrifice are the things that they specifically call it as being like, hey, check with your players to make sure they are going to enjoy a game that includes these things. And if there's like one or two things specifically, they're like, hey, I don't want any of that, you can obviously omit it as you see fit. But yeah, those are elements of this setting that we're reviewing today. Continuing on, what is the world of Midnight Legacy of Darkness? So the book does a great job of the very first chapter is just, it starts off with just a breakdown of the setting and what it is, what are you signing up for? And I'm going to give you a high level overview, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details, because this is a dense book and I read every page of it, but boy, they pack a lot in this book. You are getting a ton of lore with this book that you could just mine for your own setting if you want. If you want to run a little bit darker adventure and you already have like a homebrew setting or a setting you enjoy playing in, there's so much to steal from this book. But yeah, basically, the world used to be a very normal fantasy setting. Pantheon of gods, elves, dwarves, humans, all that kind of stuff. And then one of the gods was cast out and imprisoned to live in the mortal realm by the other gods. But something that they did not account for, or this dark god kind of twisted during the banishment process, is prison walls work both ways. And this god was trapped on the material plane, which effectively shut out the rest of the gods and the rest of the planes. So mechanically, in this setting, any spell that relies on planar travel or accessing other planes in any way doesn't work. rope trick, bag of holding, none of it. Because you cannot access any other plane. This is the only plane that you've got. And so anything that creates an extraplanar space or travels to another plane does not work. Additionally, you can't play a cleric, a good cleric anyway, in this setting. They do provide rules for creating a legate is the name of the dark clerics that serve the only god that exists in the setting, which is an evil fallen god. Now, you could potentially play one of these characters that is being redeemed over time, but I would think that you would start to lose access to some of your abilities because the god that you're pulling from, if you start actively working against them, once again, this is a table-to-table thing. But as it states in the book, clerics do not work. Same with monks. Key is not a thing that exists in this world. So monks are not a playable class in this setting. This setting is a very brave take by Edge Studio because they are taking a setting and 5th edition and basically lopping off a lot of aspects of 5th edition to say, this is the setting that you're playing in. And some of the rules from D&D 5th edition, from the SRD, from all the other 5th edition books you might own, don't work here. Does not work in this setting because from a lore standpoint, it doesn't make sense. Additionally, because you have a evil power ruling over the entirety of existence, the entirety of the world and the continent, magic is outlawed unless it's being used by members of that force. So it is also a low magic setting while maintaining the normal spell casting of D&D 5th edition by virtue of narrative. Magic is illegal. If you are caught casting spells, you will be hunted. You will be tracked down. They even have tools for tracking magic users in this setting. So you really need to pick and choose your battles if you are going to be using magic in this setting. But like I said, the first 40 pages of this book are just double column, nonstop lore dump. You have different ages because this is the third time that the Dark Lord has tried to take over the world. They just finally succeeded this time. But, the forces of the mortal world had fought them and their forces back a few times. And, it was more and more costly and infighting started and they weakened themselves to the point to where then the Dark Lord could come in and take over. The Dark Lord being named Isrador, by the way, is the name of the big bad villain in this setting. So let's get into the player options because they've done some really cool things to account for the more grimdark nature of the setting while still implementing a lot of really cool things to account for the fact that you don't have clerics and divine magic doesn't work. Even if you are a wizard or a divine soul sorcerer, doesn't work. You could take regular sorcerer spells, but you don't have access to any of the divine spells from the cleric. And so, it just doesn't work that way. And so you have to take into account things like healing, because also healing potions are magic items. They're not going to be readily available everywhere. So they've done some really interesting things that I want to get into with options for players in this setting. So in terms of playable races, everything is available. Well, no, that's not correct. Half elves and half orcs are not available in this setting, as well as tieflings and dragonborns. None of them are, according to the book, available in the setting. Obviously, it's your table. Do with it what you will. But I'm saying, according to the book, those races are not playable in this setting because from a lore standpoint, they don't make sense. The playable races that are listed in the book are humans, dwarves, elves, halflings, gnomes, and orcs. Those are your 6 playable races in Midnight Legacy of Darkness. And the reasoning being that, from a lore standpoint, these are the core races of the setting. And orcs are heavily aligned with the side of evil, but they are not themselves inherently evil. It's just culturally that is the side of the world, the part of the world that they live and grow up in. But it's totally possible to play an orc that doesn't agree culturally with that and believes that the mortal world shouldn't be, ruled under an iron fist, and actually fights against it. Also, they do this kind of interesting and weird thing with the lore to where basically humans, elves, and dwarves are the only original races / species, and then halflings are descended from elves, and gnomes and orcs are descended from dwarves, which is interesting. And the lore gets into it a little bit, but there's definitely still room for you to play as a dungeon master with that kind of thing. And like I said, at your table, you could have other races available in the setting. This is just what the lore supports, I guess. Anything outside of these, you're going to have to do the heavy lifting as a dungeon master. Okay, now this book does not provide you with any new subclasses. It does something different and potentially better. It does something called heroic paths. So when you go through the book and you're looking at the available races, most of them are beat for beat the same as what's in the player's handbook. A couple things are tweaked here and there. Some of them have an extra ability that just adds to the flavor of the world. But every player race has an option, not an option. You do select one heroic path feat at character creation. What's heroic path character feat? I'm glad you asked. So heroic paths are linear feats that you take over time. And so you have the initial one that you take at character creation, and then level 4, 8, 12, 16 are when you get the rest of the progression, stopping at the level 16 feat. And they're just exactly what I'm saying, where, they are a feat that they've created that adds a specific element or ability. And sometimes you get an ASI bump. Sometimes it's like a half feat. And what it does is it allows you to inject a flavor of the world into your character without having to create a whole new subclass. That means you can't play a subclass that you would really like to from core D&D for the sake of fitting into the world. They've added this additional element, and you don't have to take anything beyond the initial heroic path feat if you don't want to. You could take that one at character creation and then just take the feats that you would normally want to take as you level up, and that's totally fine. But I like the fact that they have level gated them so that the fighter doesn't finish their heroic path super quick because of the amount of feats that they get compared to a wizard. And additionally, from a design standpoint, Edge Studio was able to make the level 16, the capstone of the heroic path, super potent, super powerful, because they don't have to worry about a fighter taking it super quick. They level gated it, said you have to be level 16 to take this, and everyone's happy. Well, maybe not the fighter. You might have wanted to take it quicker, but you can't. Take another feat. You get so many feats. Take Sentinel or Lucky. Observant. So some of the heroic paths that stand out to me. One is the Believer, that, from a thematic standpoint, all of the gods are inaccessible in the world. And this is somebody that still holds on to their faith. Even though the gods have been lost for thousands of years, they still hold on to that belief and that hope that one day the gods will return. And what they do is they use the inspiration mechanic in mechanics, like a class features built around the inspiration mechanic. It's wild. When you take it initially, just when you finish a short or long rest, you gain inspiration. You always have inspiration when you finish a short or long rest. Okay, level 4, you can use your inspiration to end a condition on an ally within 50 feet. Charmed, frightened, paralyzed, stunned. You can use inspiration to just knock that out because your faith is what's fueling inspiration. And so you can knock them out of this state via your faith. And there's another feat where you can use your inspiration to cause your enemies to become frightened of you because of your faith. And then when you succeed, the final one, the capstone one, when you succeed on a wisdom, intelligence, or charisma saving throw, you or an ally within 30 feet of you gain inspiration because they're seeing you succeed. I love inspiration being used in a class feature capacity. I know that's not the original intent of it, but it's there. And Edge Studio is utilizing it in something really cool and thematically makes sense. Your belief is your point of inspiration, and you can give it out to others and use it to, people can be afraid of your faith, which is great. I love this. Another one the Channeler, their capstone 16 heroic path feat. It's called the Channeling, and it's such a good mechanic. I was so mad when I read it because it's so good. When you cast a spell, you gain the ability to burn an additional spell slot for a different effect. And so, like, if the spell that you're casting does a certain damage type, like you're casting Fireball, you can expend, alongside the 3rd level spell slot, you can expend a 1st level spell slot to change the damage type. So you're using more of your magical energy to manipulate the magic and cast something different. You can expend a 2nd level spell slot to re-roll any 1s or 2s on the damage die that you roll for the spell. You do have to keep the new roll though, and you only get to do it once, but you know, that's something. And then you can utilize a 3rd level spell slot if the spell requires a saving throw from a target. You can use up this 3rd level spell slot to give up to 3 creatures disadvantage on the spell's saving throw. So you're really hyper focusing it in on them. I love this. I love it because it is a hefty cost, especially for casters that have been going for a while. But in a low level world where you're probably not going to be using a whole lot of your spell slots for fear of what's going to happen, you really want to make those spells count. And so when you use them, you can put everything you have into them. And it's great. I read that and I loved it. The other big one I wanted to touch on was the Preserver, because it makes up for the fact that you don't have magical healing as readily available as traditional D&D 5th edition. The Preserver utilizes healing kits to actually save. And so when you take the initial heroic path, you can, as an action, use your healer's kit on another living creature. Neither of you can be engaged with enemies, though. So it is that kind of like pulling them back from the front line so that you can perform medicine on them. But with an action, you can use the healing kit to restore a number of hit points equal to your wisdom modifier plus a d6, a number of d6 up to your proficiency bonus. And every d6 that you roll uses 1 charge of the healer's kit. So starting out, it's only 2d6. But 2d6 plus your wisdom is not a terrible amount of healing at 1st, 2nd level. That's decent. And then Resourceful is the next one, where that allows you to replenish your healer's kit over time, and just the healing gets better and better from there. So I love that they had this forethought to include somebody, if you want to be a healer, you can. And I really like the fact that, you know, you could have a fighter that has a decent wisdom take this, and the fighter could be the healer. And it's not class restricted. There are some statistical elements to it, but I really like this concept. Okay, so getting into the next section of the book, where they cover the core classes in Midnight, they basically give a breakdown of how each class functions in the world. There are 3 classes not available in Midnight Legacy of Darkness: clerics, monks, and warlocks, because the planes are blocked off. So there's no super powerful extraplanar beings to make deals with and create warlocks, essentially. So those are the 3 classes that are just out. Now, I hear you asking, you know, if clerics are out, how in the world do paladins still exist? They do something really interesting where paladins are basically, it's just the belief in themselves, the belief from within, and the hatred of the shadow that fuels paladins. It's their convictions. It's their belief in justice for the oppressed, or freedom, or just fighting back the shadow. Those are what fuel a paladin's power, which makes them one of the greatest enemies of the shadow, because they can't be tracked like traditional magic users. And, you know, they're very powerful. They're very skilled, and they can actually heal people with a touch. And so it's really interesting what they did with paladins, and I really like it. They did create a handful of backgrounds and new feats as well as additional spells for the setting. Not going to get into a read through of all of them. They're all really good and thematically flavorful, and a lot of them do like cover the gaps by lack of healing magic that we've talked before. They do a good job of covering a lot of those gaps left behind by the lack of a monk or a cleric. Like, you have the brawler feat that allows you to upgrade your unarmed strike to a D4, or if you have them grappled, a D8 instead. So it incentivizes you grappling with people and things like that. So yeah, I like what they did with the backgrounds and feats and new spells, because they did a good job of covering up the gaps that were created by the lore of the setting. Okay, so the rest of the book is essentially lore stuff, and then we get into like the GM stuff towards the end with the monsters and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to talk about that stuff broadly at this point, and just give my thoughts on it. So from a world standpoint, a world building standpoint, excellent job. If you are somebody that's been like hankering for 5th edition Dark Sun, this might scratch that itch, because it's lower magic. You have the Night Kings that rule over instead of the Dark Lord, who obviously is over everything. You have people hunting down magic users. It's not all a desert, but it's really cool in that way. And I think with the right group, this idea of fighting against a hyper oppressive world that is constantly looking to keep you down could be compelling for some players to fight against and try to instill a sense of hope and a sense of freedom to the people of this world. So this could play really well for some tables. I will say this world is harsh. They have the laws of the land flyer, and I have it pulled up right now. And the first law is, it's like upon penalty of death, and the first one is being of elven or dwarven birth. That's the kind of setting that we're talking about, where I talked about elves, halflings, gnomes, dwarves, orcs are all of the ancestry of elves and dwarves. Now, they make the distinction, like gnomes, ally with the shadow sometimes. And so the gnomes aren't as hunted, because the next thing is collaboration with the Fae, which is elves and dwarves. Like if you are born one or you're found collaborating with them, then it's penalty of death. And so this is a very, very, very harsh setting. And that's not going to play well with some people. Some people don't find joy in a hyper dark setting. And could this setting be tweaked to be a little bit less dark? Sure. I think anything could be tweaked. But if you do that, you're trying to make it into something it's not designed to be. This is designed to be a very dark setting that the heroes of light have to stoke the embers of hope back to life. You don't have a flame, you just have the embers. And it's a long process to try and, fight back the agents of darkness. Now, I will say this is a big book, 373 pages in the PDF format that I got. And so there is a lot, and not a whole lot of those pages are dedicated to player options. You have a lot of lore in this setting, and a lot of, breaking down the various nations and the cultures and the motivations and the highlight points, the places of note. And then you also have a whole lot of the secrets of midnight, where it's, the GM stuff and monsters. And I do like the way that they did the monster manual essentially for this setting, where it's not just an alphabetical listing of like, here are all the monsters. It's broken down by monster type, and they have a little write-up on how do these types of monsters work in this setting. Like awakened plants don't exist. Just don't use awakened plants in this setting. And in those descriptions, if there are new monsters that they have included in this setting, the monster blocks will be included, broken down by monster type, as opposed to just a long alphabetical listing. And so you have new celestials and fiends based on the setting. You have new dragons and the undead. What they do with the undead, you have some new undead creatures. But basically, the undead are one cohesive force in this setting. They're called the Fell. And part of it is the idea that, all other planes are blocked off. So where do people's souls go when they die? They don't go anywhere. They stay in the shadow, and they get corrupted, and they rise again. So there are a lot of undead. And so I think that, starting out, and I was talking with some of my fellow DMs and players before I was recording this video after having read it. And I made the comment of like, I'm not the biggest grimdark fan. Like that's not settings that draw me in. But I could see the value. Like early days in a campaign set in this setting would be so dark and so depressing and such a slog. But I can see the value. And once you've hit level 16 and you're reaching the end of the campaign and you finally deal that final blow that like blows the walls open and welcomes the gods back and opens up the other planes. And, you defeated, the victory is that much sweeter because of the overwhelming force of the enemy when you started. So I can see the value in a setting like this from that standpoint of like the victories are going to be that much sweeter because they seem impossible. And this setting nails it in that regard. The setting that they paint is one that is bleak from the outset. Even talks about the fact that like public gatherings are so discouraged that you can't even use the "you met in a tavern" cliche because it doesn't make sense for a lot of people to be hanging out in a tavern at the same time. Because why would people sit around drinking together and singing songs in a world this bad? So, yeah. Final thoughts on the book, because the rest of it, like I said, they have a great section on running the game and, talking about the tone of the game and omitting things and working with lines and veils and the X system to make sure that your players are all engaged and having fun and nobody is seeing the game taken to a place that they didn't agree for it to be taken. Session 0 in a setting like this, I think, is vitally important. But I think that Edge Studio, Fantasy Flight Games, did a phenomenal job with Midnight Legacy of Darkness. I think that it is a setting that provides something that is not currently being provided by Wizards of the Coast that a lot of people want. All the people that want Dark Sun are claiming for a setting like this, like a super dark setting that you can fight against a hyper oppressive force, and also where resources are scarce. Magic is scarce. Magic items are even scarcer. And I think that this setting does a great job. And I didn't even get into like all the different like agents of the shadow and people that hunt down magic users and try to kill you for using magic. And there's so much to get into here. I might be able to dive deep, but I really want to touch on the heroic paths because that's the thing that I'm going to steal potentially from this book because I love mechanically the idea of that. But be sure to go pick up Midnight Legacy of Darkness Drive-Thru RPG. We'll have it there. And let me know, if you go pick it up, what you thought about it down below in the comments. Let me know what you think about a setting like this. Does grimdark hold an appeal for you? Or are you more of a fan of traditional fantasy settings or even solar punk where hope is abundant? Let me know down below. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been Eric, and I will see you next time.